Remember the stories your grandparents told you when you were young? How they went to the store and bought bags worth of candy for 5 cents? Or how they bought their first house for just around $1,000? These stories caused me to reflect on the prices now. What changed? It only took my grandparents a year of work to buy their first house. Nowadays, houses take a year of work just to afford the down payment. How is this considered normal now? How can we change this? In this speech, I'll go over this issue, explaining why our economy is this way and how we can solve the problem that affects each and every one of us. The first major issue that is causing this problem is the cost of living constantly rising. An article on Investopedia explains that the rising costs are caused by 3 major things. First, there is a high demand for workers and products, but not enough of either, so companies are forced to increase their prices. The second cause is when the total supply of goods and services that can be produced falls. The third is inflation expectations. In other words, the pressure on wages that is created when workers believe that inflation will continue and demand higher wages to maintain their cost of living. Higher wages mean higher costs, which are passed on to consumers as price increases. Calculations in the CPI inflation calculator explain that the dollar had an average inflation rate of 2.44% per year between 2000 and 2022, producing a cumulative price increase of 69.95%. Rising costs affects U.S. citizens in many ways. David Floyd wrote in an article in Investopedia explaining that inflation primarily affects the purchasing power of consumers. In other words, we get less, but we pay more. Consumers lose purchasing power regardless of what the inflation rate is. Lower income consumers tend to spend a higher proportion of their income on necessities than those with higher incomes. This means that they have less of a cushion against the loss of purchasing power in inflation. The poor are also less likely to own assets like real estate, which traditionally served as an inflation hedge. Inflation also keeps deflation at bay because the government has a set inflation rate, or expectations of what inflation will be. As those expectations rise, workers start demanding larger wage increases and employers pass those costs on by raising prices on output, setting off a wage price spiral. Inflation also causes interest rates to increase. I would keep adding on to this for at least a few more minutes, but we need to carry on. Not only does constant inflation rate cause this economic problem, but so does low minimum wage. In the words of J.B. Maverick, the minimum wage is the lowest hourly rate an employer can pay an employee according to the law. Many states have minimum wages in place, but the federal wage hasn't increased since 2009, despite many attempts to do so. The federal minimum wage is currently at $7.25 an hour. Employers must pay minimum wage employees whichever rate is higher, so if the federal rate is higher than the state rate, an employee gets the federal minimum wage. The same is true if the state rate is higher. Amy Gleismeyer explained in her article, The Difference Between Living Wage and Minimum Wage, that the highest minimum wage is $16.10 in Washington, D.C. It is just over half of what an individual would need to earn to even meet their family's basic needs living in that metro area. This same problem is found all over the U.S. Amy's article is a great place to find more information on your state's minimum wage and the cost of living, and I recommend you read her article to learn more about it. Since the government has last increased the minimum wage, inflation caused a loss of 14.8% of purchasing power that was mentioned earlier in the speech. Had the federal minimum wage kept pace with workers' productivity since 1968, the inflation-adjusted minimum wage would be $24 an hour. With this being said, it is clear that the minimum wage is too low along with inflation being terrible. These two issues add up and create a very hard life for lower and middle class citizens. These two issues need to be solved in order to solve our economy's largest problem, and I've come up with a solution. The Center for American Progress explains that new estimates show that raising the floor to a $15 minimum wage could increase the wages of 1 in 4 workers, which is nearly 40 million people, and lead to an annual wage increase as large as $8,000 for some of the lowest wage workers. As I explained earlier, if the minimum wage was adjusted to keep pace with workers' productivity, it would be $24 an hour, with adjustments to inflation. The government needs to raise the minimum wage to align with the work that people are putting in and inflation. In order to be able to raise the minimum wage and not influence inflation, the government needs to use fiscal policies to raise the minimum wages instead of using policies to pay for people who are not working but could be working. It is smarter for the government to fund people who work hard rather than fund lazy citizens and hurt the economy. This solution needs citizens like us to be able to make it work. We need to get the government's attention. We can do this by creating peaceful marches or sending letters. For those who don't want to participate in marching or writing letters, there will be plenty of opportunities to fund our mission. Some people may not want to help, and that's okay. Those people may believe that if companies raise their wages, that inflation will continue to rise. Though this is true, it will not be as much of a concern for our solution. With our solution, the funds that help create higher wages are funded by government with the funds that were used to help non-workers who could have worked. In other words, these workers will be funded by the money that lazy citizens could have used to help themselves get a job, but didn't use it correctly. Since these funds are from the government and not the companies themselves, there would be no need to raise the prices of anything. With that being said, there is no reason to not support this solution. So, when we think of our grandparents' stories, remember the reasons our economy has changed and remember what we can do to help it. Remember we can use the government fundings for the right things, and we can raise our wages to help low-income citizens, and that we can do that all without raising the cost of living. Following this solution plan is how we can solve the terrible economic problem that affects each and every one of us.